systematic process for strategy development. So, why is having a process important? And to answer this, basically, the reason I chose this topic is because this was something that I lacked when I began in poker. And this was something that I didn't find anywhere, especially in training sites or whatever content there is online. There's not much content into developing an idea of how to consistently improve by yourself. Poker is a profession, is an activity in which you have to be your own boss, which means that you have to create your own rules and create your own study habits, and there's no structure built for yourself. You have to build your own structure. And this is sometimes very hard for someone who has never been in such environments. Life, whenever we are in a job or at school, there's always a structure built for us. In our families, there's always a set time for everything. There's always a series of events that happens in our lives that were not determined by us. But in poker, it's not like this. You have to be the person who designs how things are going to go from which point to whatever point you want to get to. So I often see players in the forums or even my students saying stuff like, well, I don't know how to improve. I don't know how to keep improving. I don't know. I feel confused about what should I do next. I feel confused of what should I study, etc., etc., etc. So all of this confusion, all of this this stress comes from not having a process, not having a structure in order to be consistent with your study habits. So that's why we're going to be creating a process. And by doing this, we're not going to be wasting any time figuring out what to do next, which is also something that many players struggle with. So they sit down to study, but they have no idea what to do. And this just ends up being some time waste. So by having a process, we're always going to have a path to follow. And because of that, we're going to be improving much faster. And not only this, but we're also going to gain confidence, because when you're consistent with your study habits, this gives you confidence that you're actively taking the necessary steps to improve your game. And this certainly makes a difference in our performance. However, before we start talking about developing our strategy, we need to talk about the 3 key elements of strategy development. So in order for you to efficiently develop your strategy, you need to consider these 3 key elements. You need to consider the relationship between them. So the 3 key elements of strategy development are exploitability, complexity, and profitability. I imagine that 100% of players or 100% of people watching this video understand complexity and profitability. And exploitability should also be somewhat self-explanatory, but if you don't understand this term, it just means obviously how exploitable your strategy is, or in other words, how much EV can your opponent generate by exploiting your strategy. So it means that you're playing a strategy that is not a GTO strategy, not an unexploitable strategy, and therefore your opponent can change his strategy in order to maximize EV against you. So exploitability is a measure of how much EV can your opponent gain by trying to exploit you. So when you take into consideration these 3 variables, there's a different number of strategies we can create or we can design by messing with these 3 variables. The first strategy I'm going to talk about is the ideal strategy. The ideal strategy is a strategy that has low exploitability, which means that there's nothing the other players can do in order to exploit you. You're playing a strategy that doesn't really have any leaks. The ideal strategy has also low complexity. It's very easy to implement, and it's highly profitable, so it has high profitability. The only problem about the ideal strategy is that it doesn't exist. So it's impossible for you to come up with a strategy that has low exploitability, that has low complexity, and that has high profitability. It simply cannot exist. So there are many possible strategies we can at least try to implement in poker, and I'm going to list a few of them that I think are the most common in today's games. So the first one is the Pseudo GTO strategy. I call this Pseudo GTO strategy because I don't really want to call it GTO strategy, because I think it's impossible for humans to effectively apply a complete GTO strategy. So let's call it Pseudo GTO strategy. So a Pseudo GTO strategy is a strategy that obviously tries to mimic GTO play, and by definition, it's going to be a strategy that has low exploitability and high complexity and medium high profitability. So whenever you're playing a very low exploitability strategy, that means you're going to have to increase complexity. So if you want to decrease the exploitability of your strategy, that usually implies that your complexity is going to go up. So this is kind of intuitive, and that's why we say we can't implement solver strategy. Even though it has zero exploitability, it's very hard for us to choose that strategy to play in any game because the complexity is too high. And it does offer us with medium to high profitability. I inputted medium to high because sometimes it might not be the highest EV strategy against certain player profiles, but it certainly performs very well against pretty much any player. This type of strategy is often chosen for tough games like high stakes NL or 500 zone games, for example. Now, the next type of strategy you can implement is the maximal explorative strategy. Basically, it's a strategy that is highly exploitable, so it has high exploitability. It's a strategy that has low to medium complexity, but it's a strategy that has very high profitability. So the maximal explorative strategy is a strategy that is basically just trying to get every tiny piece of EV it can find by trying to exploit every single player in every single node of the game tree. So you're going to be basically hunting down for any possible mistakes your opponent is making, and then applying the maximally exploitative strategy against that league. The problem with playing the maximally exploitative strategy is that when trying to exploit a certain player, you make your strategy exploitable in the process. So it's impossible for you to be exploiting a certain player or a certain strategy or a certain league without making yourself exploitable in the process. So the maximally exploitative strategy has high exploitability. However, it does offer low to medium complexity, because oftentimes the maximal exploitative strategy means, for example, you should just always bet your bluffs in a given spot, or you should always check your bluffs because your opponent is overcalling. So it definitely has low to medium complexity compared to other strategies. And of course, it has high profitability because you're constantly maximizing EV in every single node of the game tree. This type of strategy is often chosen for soft or anonymous games. And then the final example I gave here is the simplified exploitative strategy. The simplified exploitative strategy has medium exploitability, it has medium complexity, and it has high profitability. So the simplified exploitative strategy is a little bit different than the maximal exploitative strategy. Instead of trying to exploit your opponent in every single node of the game tree, you're actually going to be trying to simplify your game by taking exploitative actions in situations where you think make the most sense, whereas you're going to be decreasing the exploitability of your strategy by taking simplified actions on many different occasions. So basically this means you're going to be reducing strategic options to make your game tree more simple, and in the process you're going to be reducing the exploitability of your strategy by not taking or not attempting to gain every single piece of EV in every single spot. The strategy doesn't have low complexity. It's certainly more complex than the maximal exploitative strategy, but it's still not as complex as trying to play pseudo GTO strategies with mixed strategies everywhere. and it still has higher profitability because you're still maximizing EV in many different occasions versus your opponents. And this is my strategy choice. You should just pick yours. I'm not here trying to convince you that any of these types of strategies is the best. I think you have to consider your environment, you have to consider your current level of ability, and all the other variables that should be relevant in choosing which type of strategy you want to play.